Hi, welcome back. And this is the Catholic Lady. And we are reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. We're at chapter 19. And um, Aristo has gone to Jerusalem to inform Saul, soon to be Paul, that his father has passed away. And now we're going to be seeing what Aristo is doing while Saul is in his official mourning. Chapter 19, Part 1. Aristo did not see Saul again for 4 weeks, for those were days of family mourning. So the Greek remained in his inn. He had no taste for Roman arenas and gladiators and pugilists. He had lost his lust for women, except on rare occasions. He was alone in Jerusalem, which he strongly disliked for its air of brooding and ominous destiny and pent and silent violence of spirit. Even the Roman soldiers were less hardy here, and went about with the gloomy faces. Aristo struck up a few conversations with their officers and was invited to a few dinners, and entertained at his inn in return. "This Israel," said one officer, shaking his head, "it is more than I can endure. No one can ever comprehend the Jews. Pontius Pilate, once moved to generosity and expansiveness, offered to put a statue of the Jewish god in the temple of Jupiter, so he could be honored also, and had to withdraw his offer hastily, for all Israel vowed insurrection, even to the last man among them, if the last man among them died. How can a reasonable man understand such a people? And what deity they possess? He's a veritable Pluto, without an entrancing Proserpine, of course. In truth, there is no beauty in their God, nor in his heaven. And who would desire to go there?" He shuddered. "They love him, one conjectures why," said Aristo. "Nevertheless, you must admit that their temple is grand and lovely, and so it is possible that their God does not despise beauty." Aristo attended a few Greek theaters and gloried in the spectacles, but he was growing bored, and when he received a letter from his friend Tellus, telling him to visit him at his house, having returned from a mysterious journey to a small and possibly barbarous little Jewish town called Capharnaum. Tellus mentioned that it was a poor market town of no significance, but he, Tellus, had a tale to tell. Aristo must dine with him that night. Aristo was only too happy. He arrayed himself magnificently, as befitted a man of much land and many groves and considerable money. And he remembered that Tellus had promised to introduce him to a stockbroker who was a man of enormous talent in Jerusalem. So he hired a fine litter with silken curtains and rich cushions, and was carried in state to Tellus's house. He understood that the majority of men deplored the monopoly of wealth, especially if they were themselves wealthy and indulged themselves in that monopoly. They had a low opinion of men who dressed and lived simply. Aristo had put his most fiery large opal, surrounded by diamonds, on his right index finger, a chain of emeralds about his neck, gemmed armlets on his arms, a golden girdle about his waist, jeweled sandals on his feet. His cloak was of cloth of gold. "I am a veritable Zeus blazing," he said to himself with satisfaction. He could remind Tellus that he knew stockbrokers of great gifts in Tarsus. He would remind Tellus that he knew stockbrokers of great gifts in Tarsus, which was a seat of culture. He also had Roman stockbrokers and was invested in a ship. If he had not certainly mentioned to Tellus that he had once been a slave, and from some gestures and intonations Tellus had unwittingly displayed at times, Aristo suspected that Tellus had himself once endured that state. Gentlemen do not recall unpleasant matters to each other. Aristo had hinted that a dear friend of his, the noble Hillel ben Baruch, had left him a considerable legacy, which was quite true, and had also hinted that the legacy had been given in gratitude, which Aristo hoped was true. The house of Tellus was on the lower flank of a mount, which was unusually green with trees and groups of cypresses, and it was a large and impressive building of white stone and gardens and gates, and Aristo was duly impressed. It was sunset, and the house beamed with rose. Tellus met Aristo in the portico and embraced him, and his voice was full and round as if greeting a friend one had known for a life, but has not seen for a long time. His manner was high and exuberant, his walk swift, his gestures vivid. He conducted Aristo into the atrium, which was colorful with Persian rugs, lively with bright murals on the walls, and large and stately and excellently furnished ivory and mother of pearl, and gorgeous with velvet cushions of every hue. There was a fountain in the center of alabaster, somewhat indecent and depraved, but beautifully carved, and the leaping waters were scented with the odor of lilies. Aristo was careful not to display undue admiration, for this incited contempt, as for a base fellow who had never seen luxury before. However, it was also evident that Tellus expected some comment, discreet as from a connoisseur, and from one who knew the worth of treasures. So Aristo kindly remarked that this bronze or alabaster statuette on a golden or black onyx pedestal was surely worthy of a Zeno or even a Phidias, and whose Alexandrian lamps in purple and crimson glass were among the most delicate and graceful he had ever seen. Even his friend, the noble Hillel ben Baruch of Tarsus, noted for his magnificent house and treasures, had no better than these, and everyone knew that Hillel was a discriminating collector of art. He had had emissaries not only in Greece but in Alexandria, also being somewhat of an Egyptologist. In parentheses, may gods overlook that lie, thought Aristo, as if there are gods, for was not my master a man of better taste? These amenities now concluded, Tellus clapped his hands, and the overseer of the hall entered. And Tellus ordered him to tell his mistress, the Lady Iantha, that his master and his noble guest Aristo were prepared to dine. While waiting for the summons from the Lady Iantha, they would enjoy a goblet of wine in the atrium, which was pleasantly warm. "The Lady Iantha is your wife?" Tellus asked Aristo, with some surprise, for Tellus had never spoken of a wife before. "No, my daughter, a childless widow, alas, who now dwells with me. She cossets me like a devoted wife, and I do not reject the cosseting, for she is my only child." Aristo preferred the company of young women and girls, and was somewhat distressed at the thought of a middle-aged widow, for Tellus was at least 60 for all his newly virile appearance, and the color in cheeks and on lips, which had not been there on the ship. Aristo hoped that Tellus observed the old Greek order, and that Iantha would not be present at dinner. And then he remembered how Tellus had jested over the old Jewish women who kept hidden in the houses of their husbands. "What is more charming than a fair face at a feast?" he had asked. "Women are not intelligent, but they are enchanting to gaze upon." Chilled wine was brought, and the goblets wreathed in vine leaves were of carved silver, and the wine was marvelously colored and the flavor delightful. Aristo made a judicious face on tasting it, and knowing his host was watching, gave a slight nod, the cultured accolade again of the connoisseur. He wondered, not without amusement, if Tellus knew he was attempting to deceive him, and so the air between them took on a mirthful sparkle. He glanced at Tellus and wondered anew at the new animation of his host. His vivacity, his color, the vitality of his hair, and his look of absolute health. Was it possible that this man was the pale and tenuous shadow he had met on the ship from Tarsus? The shadow who had a cancer and had but a short time to live. "You are looking much improved in health, Tellus," he said. Tellus's face took on a light of ardor, and his dark eyes glistened. "Ah," he said, That is a miraculous tale which I intend to tell you tonight. You have met one of those holy Jewish rabbis who cure in a twinkling? Asked Aristo with incredulity. The overseer returned to announce that the dinner was waiting, and Tellus rose and said, "Let us dine, if it please you, my friend. Then we will converse." They entered the dining hall, and Aristo was again deeply impressed by the large beauty of the room, which was far handsomer than the dining hall of Hillel's house, and crowded with treasures. And here large Chinese vases stood in corners filled with gilded sheaves of wheat, and exotic flowers, and huge green leaves. And the air was scented. The white marble floor gleamed where it was not hidden by beautiful Persian carpets, and the table was covered with cloth of silver, and 5 slaves were waiting, beautiful boys, finely clad, to serve the Lord and his guest. Also waiting was a lovely woman, apparently not yet 30, and in her ripest and sleekest years. She was tall but slight, and she was clad in a blue silken chiton, with a jeweled circlet about her slender waist. Her sandals were jeweled also, and her white arms were bare and smooth and exquisitely formed, as was her neck. She had the true Grecian face, with the round, full chin, the daintily curled red lips, the long nose that tapered from her white brow, without an indentation at the bridge, and the calm, smooth brow. Her eyes were like silver coins and very bright and sparkling. Her lashes were autumn-colored, as were her brows, and her auburn hair was dressed in the Grecian manner and bound with silver ribbons. Brilliant earrings clung to her rosy ears and cast their reflection on the neck like pink alabaster. Aristo had not seen so enthralling a woman since the delightful Deborah Bathsheba, and he silently, with his eyes, gave her the worship of a Greek due a woman like a goddess. She saw this and smiled demurely and dropped her eyes. Her father took her hand tenderly, and again she smiled, this time with deep affection, and Tellus said, "Is not my Iantha a veritable Naiad?" Iantha blushed, and Aristo was delighted, for he could not remember seeing a woman blush before, and this was no virgin, but a widow. She sat beside her father, and it was evident that she intended to give all her attention to his comfort, and to help him to the most tasty morsels. And Aristo marveled at such devotion, and envied Tellus. The woman, of course, was a fool, but an adorable fool, and Aristo approved of beautiful women who were fools. Alas, that his next thought was that all this luxury, all these jewels, were not the result of a certainty of honest dealing and virtuous affairs. Aristo suspected that his host was engaged in some nefarious business, such as smuggling under the noses of the Romans, if not worse, as well as open pursuits. So Aristo envied him, and wondered if his friend, Tellus, could not give him a confidential word or two when they were alone. Aristo was confirmed in his suspicions when he saw the silver platters, the silver and enameled plates, and the golden spoons and knives, and the gilded goblets. The napkins were of the silkiest of Egyptian linen, and scented with rose. The repast was not like Roman repast, of which Aristo had recently sadly learned from his new Roman friends. It was Greek, though, thank the gods, the wine was not resinous, but it was of a Greek style that could only have been inspired from Olympus, which cultivated Jews now favored above their own fashion in food. There were tiny brown fish broiled in butter and smoked British oysters, and butter as sweet as honey, bread as white as snow and as hot as Hades, roasted lamb in a divine sauce with mushrooms and touches of rosemary and bay and ginger root from China, artichokes in sour wine and garlic, a mere suggestion of the latter. Unlike the Romans, a roasted pig so small that it was evident that it had not even had time to suck. And russet and crackling and luscious and stuffed with herbs on a gleaming platter with a pomegranate in its mouth, and rolled cabbage leaves filled with spicy hot meat, and grapes steeped in wine and honey, and gilt bowls heaped with a medley of fruits and nuts, and a carved board bearing many choice cheeses and pastries so delicate that they appeared fashioned of clouds, encasing sweetmeats that oozed a thick red jelly, and a wine whose bottles were so dusty that they attested to the age and mellowness. Iantha never ceased a soft and gentle murmuring as she selected morsels for her father to eat, but that murmuring did not annoy Aristo. It merely added to his enjoyment. He watched Iantha's white hands deftly moving, deftly serving. She had little time to eat herself, though the boys expertly served her and Aristo, gliding like beautiful statues about the table. Somewhere there was the benign and musical stirrings of zithers, and a threnody of harp, and all was harmony, and the lamps glowed, and the wine was beyond compare. And we'll pause there and start with part 2 shortly.